Welcome to Intersect, a podcast where we find connection in each other's story. We're back today with Carl Wilkins, author of the book I'm Not Leaving, one of the sole Americans who remained in Rwanda through the genocide of 1994. In our last episode, we jumped in and out of a few brief narratives of that time and reflected on some of the significance and lessons from those events. And in this episode, we want to reflect on, as the dust has settled and the ceasefire has come, and the years since the tragedy. Obviously, it seems that there had to be a wrestling with what is justice and how is justice done once a horrible injustice has been done. Carl, there's some significant work that the country of Rwanda has done. You've been involved with some of that work. Tell us about the wrestling of what is justice.
Yeah, for sure. And I haven't really been involved in the work they've done in Rwanda. I've just been an amazed observer and amazed student of what they're doing in Rwanda. You know, you use the word ceasefire, and not to be picky, but I think it's important for people to understand that sometimes people commit genocide and they stay in power. You know, we did horrible things in genocide with Native Americans and stayed in power. And so at the end of the Rwandan genocide, it didn't just end like a storm ends or anything. A small dedicated group, mostly of refugees from Rwanda who had gotten military training, they came together in an organization called the Rwandan Patriotic Front. They're the ones who ended the genocide. They're the ones who liberated the country from this genocidal coup group, this group of extremists. And then they had the unimaginable task of rebuilding. And it's interesting that the general of the Rwandan Patriotic Front, he and I were both born in 1957. So at the time of the genocide, we're both 36 years old. I'm doing what I can with a small handful of colleagues and you know, trying to help groups of orphans. On the big picture, this man is leading initially 10,000, and it'll grow to 20,000 soldiers, very, you know, meagerly armed and equipped, but they will drive the extremists out of power, out of the country, and then they'll have the job of rebuilding. Not from ground zero, like you'd think, oh, everything was destroyed. If it was a tsunami, that might be like ground zero. But this is neighbor destroying, killing neighbor. You know, this is pastors and all kinds of teachers and people you thought you could trust participating in this horrible time called genocide. So it's like they're trying to rebuild from way below zero. And the largest loss, of course, is the loss of life and all the potential in the future and family members and all of that. Next to that is the loss of trust. And that's something that I think we understand around the globe these days is kind of a deficit of trust, not feeling like you can trust. So how anybody, you know, not in government, you know, but even trust in business and trust in your family, trust in your faith group. So Rwanda is going to do, there's so much we could talk about here. So I'm going to try to fast forward a little bit, because initially they tried to do the regular, and this is your question, justice. They tried to do what we typically understand as justice. And my simple explanation, I have like a little pyramid when I'm talking with students. At the foundation there is laws. So, you know, justice is built on laws. And then the next level is we try to find out who's to blame, and then we punish them. And then we call that justice. Now, the problem with justice is it doesn't go far enough. Rarely does justice break the cycle of violence. Rarely does somebody go through the justice system and come out a better neighbor. You know, they go to prison and they often come out a better crook in different ways. And so imagine next to this pyramid of laws, who's to blame, punish them, justice, we have another pyramid, another model that's based on a practice they've done for hundreds of years in Rwanda that they called gacaca. And it's going to be reshaped and made in this situation into the form of community courts. And if you were to describe these community courts, at the bottom, there are laws and rules and things, but the key thing at the bottom is a strong community. Because our next level is not going to be blame. Our next level is going to be understand the harm, unpack the harm, especially to the people who the greatest harm was done to. And then our next level, instead of punishment, is going to be repair. Now, there will be some punishment in the repair. There will be some justice in the repair. But this model, based on community, strong community, sense of safety, empathy, because we're going to be, when we unpack the harm, we're talking murder and rape and the worst types of things. So we can't just unpack that in a void or without preparing a strong support group, the community, to support us as we unpack the harm. And then as we look at, well, what will a repair plan look like? We need to hear from everybody. The perpetrator's voice, those who stood by and did nothing, their voice, the victims, those who survived, their voice. We need to hear all of the voices to understand the harm, make a repair plan. And our top priority here isn't justice, it's healing. One of the things I'm not happy with is I have developed this kind of graphic for, as I talk with students about this, is I kind of compare and contrast, blame, understand the harm, punish, repair, justice, healing. But really, the more I dig into this, the more I realize it's not one or the other. It's that this model of punitive justice just doesn't go far enough to rebuild trust, to bring healing. So it'll be kind of into this new, which is actually a really old model, which is really old whether you're in New Zealand looking at restorative practice or you're looking in Canada, you're looking at America. I've talked with a retired federal judge and explained to him what was going on in Rwanda. And he's like, those were some of the things we were working with on the reservations who have a separate legal system. So anyway, the restorative always tracks back to the indigenous groups. But in Rwanda's case, they're going to set up more than 12,000 community courts. And the judges will be ordinary community members chosen by their community. And to really be facilitators, the court system is going to be overwhelmed in Rwanda. More than 300,000 people accused of genocide. It would take more than 100 years, more money than they had, more judges than they had, more lawyers. It was overwhelming. So this is an interesting idea. Genocide was done by ordinary people. Could healing be done by ordinary people? Could we empower the ordinary citizens? Not in the same way they were empowered to kill their neighbor, but could they be empowered to restore and rebuild relationships?
It's interesting. Your community, understanding
the harm, repairing.
Repair. I don't know if there's an E like empathy, but my mind went cure.
Yeah, well, that's the healing at the top, if you do that. And so I see what you're saying. Yeah. Gotcha. I like it.
So you've got these, you said like there wouldn't be years enough with all that were involved in take over 100 years. And so embedded in this kind of indigenous culture and framework was the core rudimentary elements to set something up like this, where you're saying that the genocide was committed by one segment of the community coming against the other segment of the community. It was kind of ordinary Joes and Janes, if you will. And so now we're saying, well, we're going to turn around and flip this on its head, and we're going to call the community to be a community of to borrow from Henry Nouwen, wounded healers.
Yeah, it's a formidable task that seems in many ways impossible. I mean, get this for a second. Say we're back in the genocide and we're trying to empower people to destroy. Genocide stems from thinking that says, my world would be better without you in it. And unfortunately, that thinking finds some resonance, I think, in all of our brains. Not that we want to kill, but often we think if we can just get rid of it, if I don't have to deal with this person, if this guy wasn't here, how easy it would be. If we didn't have this student, if we didn't have this church member, if we didn't have this business partner, whatever, we think we're going to solve a problem by excluding. And that, unfortunately, kind of goes with a lot of the wiring of our brain. So now General Kagame, who will eventually, who led the Rwandan Patriotic Front to liberate, to end the genocide, to liberate, is going to have the enormous task of trying to lead a country of people away from punitive blame thinking to restorative healing thinking. And it's like, how are you going to rewire these brains? How are you going to do something like that? And I'd like to give you an example of just two families to try to look at this challenge after the genocide. The one lady, Maria, survived. She also was around my age. And it was interesting because, we often, when we learn people's stories, we think of our own story and we look at ways that we connect the dots. And that's a large part of empathy, the ability to connect the dots between my story and your story. That it goes a long ways against othering when we actually can connect the dots. Maria, and I even think she might have had 3 kids. I'm not 100% sure, but I think 3 children. She and her husband their first priority was their kids, like for my wife and I. They'd made the decision to separate as they were trying to hide. He'll take, I think it was 2 boys, and she took the little baby girl. Maybe neighbors will be a little more sympathetic, a little more willing to hide, to feed 2 of us or 3 of us than 5 of us. Sure. A lot of families, I'm told, in Rwanda made that tough decision to spread like that. It'll work for her and her daughter. It won't for her husband and sons. We'll meet Maria, 25. I say we, I'm in Rwanda. That summer, I took 2 groups. One was a group of students from Chicago. Another was a group of teachers that I work with in all the schools. I travel around and I speak at schools about the genocide and about the restorative journey. So I meet a lot of teachers and they want to go to Rwanda. And so we go there so they can see for themselves not only the tragedy and horrors of the genocide, but talk to the survivors, talk to perpetrators, talk to the next generation, see how the country is moving forward and how they have been and continue to heal. And so I'm there this summer, 2 different groups, and I meet Maria, who survived with her little baby girl. And she introduces us to Filbert, an incredibly valued family friend. I mean, she was lost without her husband and sons in many ways. Filbert comes and helps with planting season, comes and brings people to help with harvesting. She says he does things for me like my sons would have done if they were alive. Now, by the time she said that, I knew already. We'd been told the other part of the story. I haven't told you yet. Filbert was in the gang, 18 years old young man in the gang who killed Maria's husband and sons. Now, I at the beginning, when I would be telling this story, I was like, people are just going to think I'm trying to be a sensationalist or something. But there are many stories like this. And I'm not trying to yank or set somebody up for a big shock or surprise. I don't know how to tell some of these stories. They're so sensational, but they're so real in Rwanda. She will say that when he got out of prison, she tried to avoid him. He came home to they were both from the same community. They were too poor to they didn't have, that they could sell or move. And, we have the privilege in the West often. I'll never live in that house again, not after what happened there. They didn't have those privileges. Most of the people in Rwanda had to go back and face the trauma and the horrors of what happened in their own homes, in their own towns, in their own churches. And so she just does her best to avoid him. He tries to avoid her, but she's been wanting to know for I don't know how many years where her husband and sons are buried, and he knows. And she says that was our turning point. Me and Filbert, that was our turning point. And when we meet him 25 years after the genocide, that's I don't know how many years of rewiring her brain and him rewiring his brain. You see, in the bigger picture, when they would have these community courts, prisoners could come and confess, and people in the community could ask questions. They could begin to learn the truth. You know, we have this expression in Christianity or Christ, you know, the truth will set you free. The truth is so valuable to healing. When I don't know the truth of the harm, I make up. I mean, I don't make up, but I imagine things. We're all storytellers, story makers. We're all story people. We live and think in stories. And so when we don't know the truth, we well, maybe it was this, maybe it was that. But maybes are very hard to accept. And acceptance is very crucial to healing.
So what is it then that, like, for those that were the victim, what is it about hearing the truth of the harm from the victimizer that now, like, brings them to where, what, like, how do they become closer together through that process of the victimizer saying the truth of the harm and the victim hearing it? Like, you would think that that would only make them more,
drive them apart. Yeah. Make them more angry and stuff. And that's logical. That's logical. Pain and grief is often not logical. Pain and grief is a world of its own. And when you live in it for so long and you look for relief from it, you actually can find that the perpetrator, number one, just hearing them admitting to what they did, many people have said is super valuable for them.
A relief.
Well, it's like, I knew they did it and it was wrong, and they may not even be sorry, because some of these guys who would confess in Gacaca, I'm sure, weren't sorry, but they were taking the Gacaca, the community court route, because that could get them out of prison in half the time of sitting and waiting for a regular trial. So some of them weren't even sorry. And my initial thoughts were, well, what good's a confession from somebody who's not sorry? And I realized, well, wait, it can help people. One, you know, one person said to me, to have a face connected. I didn't know who had done it. And to have a face connected with who did it to my family was really important. I think, again, there's all this unknown in our mind, and it's hard to accept and process the unknown. So when I had a face, they said, really valuable. When they admitted that they did it, really valuable. And if they happened to be sorry, that was also, to different degrees, different people, valuable for them. Now the problem is, what are we going to do with them there? And that's where this understand the harm part would then move to the repair part. And they would give these people who had confessed, who had come, typically it'd be Thursday afternoon, close school, close shops, go to the soccer field. Every community has a soccer field. And set up a couple tables there. We'll have 9 judges that were chosen by the community. At least 3 of them will be women, because the Constitution of Rwanda says every group who has power, authority, a minimum of a third of that group has to be women, whether it's parliament, whether it's these community judges. That they realize, if we're going to rebuild trust, and I could go on and on about the gender equality, but if we're going to rebuild trust, we've got to have women empowered to be part of this process, because they are some of the best trust builders. Research science shows this. So the old Gacaca was just the village male elders who had come together to solve the problem. The new Gacaca, the post-genocide, was men and women, again, chosen by the community, who will then facilitate this Thursday afternoon confession, question, and answer time. And then those judges will decide, is somebody like Filbert, are they safe to go work in the community? Because here's where we're going to run into a little bit of a problem with our ideas of justice. So many times with justice, we are looking for payback. We are looking for, restitution. And when somebody is killed, raped, horrible things like that, there is no payback. There is no restitution for those things. And so we just say, well, life in prison, or we even tried the death penalty and stuff. And still, that doesn't. Rarely does punishment bring satisfaction to those who suffered the pain. I mean, it's better than no punishment, but still there's the loss in that. So that's why this other model, a restorative model, is what Rwanda is opting for. Let's let go of the traditional model. Let's have people come, learn the truth, and begin to talk together and begin to see each other as more than one, more than a victim, or the other one, more than a murderer. Because I think what keeps us trapped in our anger and bitterness is one thing thinking. And one thing thinking is so often defined by the worst thing a person has done. So,
or the worst thing a person has experienced.
Exactly.
Like something like just a thing that's triggering in my mind as you're talking is the social scientists. You referred to Brene Brown, I think maybe in the last podcast, but I think maybe, is it Gardner? There's somebody she cites, but the social sciences are telling us, irrespective of what the faith community is saying, we are wired for love and belonging.
You bet. Big time.
If that is true from just a scientific, observed social science perspective, then wouldn't it make sense that the only way that we're going to find our way to some sense of wholeness or healing is a restorative model, because it is the model that's going to create the space for the renewal of love and belonging?
Yeah. Not the exclusion, the separation, the locking up and away. Now, I mean, sometimes people need to be locked up for the safety of everyone. Restorative is not for everyone. Restorative is a collaborative process. Our justice system is an adversarial process. Our political system is not a collaborative. I mean, there's collaborative components, but usually only, with their arm tied, twisted behind their back, and, with no other choice, then okay, we'll compromise. But we don't. So collaborative is a key to this one, and people have to be willing to buy into that. And so when the judges would facilitate a confession and the community would ask and stuff, and they'd say, okay, I think this person's safe to come back into the community for the next stage, the repair stage. Not payback, but an opportunity to reinvent yourself, to show that you can be a valuable member of society, to show that you're more than a murderer. And they would do that by building roads, building homes, doing radical terracing. They called it community service. And it was probably a year and a half ago. I'm talking with some, I don't even remember what school it was, but these high school seniors. This one girl said, whoa, wait a minute. People who did genocide get community service? It's like a slap on the wrist. And I'm like, I hear you. Boy, do I hear you. And that's when I pulled back up on the screen the punitive and the transformative pyramids. And the punitive pyramid, we slap a big label over it, transactional. You do this crime, you get this punishment. The restorative model, we slap over that, transformational. People can change. We believe people can change. Our top priority here isn't justice. It's important. It's going to be part of the repair plan, but our top priority is healing up here. And so if I look at a restorative model with transactional glasses, I'm going to be, that's a joke, But if I look at this model with a transformative lens, that our goal here is to, as you said, love and belong, to restore relationships, to bring fathers home, to bring midwives back to the community, to bring teachers home, to bring nephews, to restore and rebuild, even in the most impossible situation. If we decide, you know what? Okay, I'm not doing it because I think the perpetrators deserve it. Nope, they don't deserve it. I'm not doing it because logically it makes sense. I may be doing it because I want my kids to grow up in a safe place, and I want something that will break the cycle of violence. And this transactional punitive model rarely breaks the cycle of violence. Now, I'm not throwing it out, okay? Remember I said earlier, we're trying to incorporate some in, but we need to go beyond this justice. We need to go to the healing. And so Maria and Filbert, when he comes back out of prison, I got the impression she didn't find out where her husband and sons were buried from a gacaca. I got the impression she found out later when he came back to the community. And she identified that as a turning point for her and Filbert. And now is when I just want to, and if we have to stop after this, I'm fine, but I just want to get this one thing in here.
Bring it on. Bring it on.
Is that, well, I'm often wondering, how does somebody go from a kind, generous person to a murderer? Is that, why is that even possible? Or how did it happen? And we talked last time about upstairs brain, downstairs brain, how when you're in fear, you're the most manipulable, you're most vulnerable to manipulation. Yeah. Mm-hmm. We don't doubt that this happens because we see the bodies, we see the results. What we often find almost impossible to believe is, can they ever be trusted again? Could they be a better neighbor after than they were before? And it would be nice if they could be, because before they were susceptible to genocide thinking. My world would be better without you in it. Afterwards, could they appreciate the value of women more and the rights of women more? Could they understand a restorative approach instead of a punitive approach that we almost all live under all of our life? Would they begin to understand that there's a model called power with, as opposed to power over, which usually brings fear, which usually brings violence? And so we won't go into all of those details, but Filbert, what really gave me hope as I was wrestling with how could you do that? Can you ever be trusted? I then learned about neuroplasticity and that we can actually rewire our brain. I can make choices that form new pathways in my brain, and that will actually begin to minimize old pathways in my brain. So I have a little graphic where I've got Maria and Filbert side by side in a picture. I'm actually standing with them in a picture we all took together in 2019. And I say, when Filbert came out of prison and she would look at him, I'm sure she fired pathways in her brain of anger and bitterness and confusion and grief and avoidance. But then when he helped her find where her husband and sons were buried, she started to learn more of his story. That when he was in prison and considering confessing, some of the other prisoners threatened him because his confession would implicate them. And he still went against that. Now she would fire a pathway that would be gratitude, help me find my husband. Truth, he told the truth. A pathway maybe of courage. He went after the other men in the gang who killed her husband and sons until they confessed, kept going until they apologized. And you can see how she's building a whole new network to fire when she sees Filbert. The old network of anger, bitterness, and grief. Well, the pathway that he killed my husband will never disappear. But the old pathways of anger and bitterness and grief are fired less often. And this is one of the cool things about the brain, is when we build new pathways, the neuroscientists tell us there's this NGF, this nerve growth factor. Some refer to it as a brain glue. Because you see, Jim, the job of the brain is to keep us alive. And to keep us alive, it's got to gather data, store it, and retrieve it in a way that will keep us alive, and a way to keep us, healthy. And so when we decide to make certain pathways permanent in our brain, like I was telling you about breathing exercises I've been doing for the last 6 months, we develop new pathways in our brain. And if we're serious and we stick with it, like finding the good, looking for the good, believing the potential for good is in everybody, we stick with those pathways. The brain says, hey, this guy seems to be serious about this new set of pathways. We need some NGF. And it's not in abundant supply. Is anybody not using your NGF here in the brain? Well, we're not using it so much here with anger, bitterness, and grief anymore with Filbert. Here, take theoretically, the NGF from that neural network, that bundle of pathways, can be transferred over to this new pathway. And that becomes less, they call it pruning, less and less influential, less and less active in my brain, and this becomes more and more influential. So literally, I'm an old shop teacher. I love nuts and bolts stuff. And when I learned that we can actually, by our choices, shape new pathways in our brain that will then influence other existing pathways or develop new pathways, I started with gratitude, trying to counter a critical spirit in myself towards my wife, towards my children. I started gratitude for food. That spawned pathways of gratitude for toll takers. That's a whole nother story, But it then can spawn other pathways in my brain. So the government, on a large scale, is trying to make it safe, provide the community with opportunities to build and rebuild bonds. Maria and Filbert were building homes together in their community. They were trying to avoid each other, but they needed a new home. Filbert needed a new, and the government says, we'll give you like cement and roofing sheets. You do the adobe bricks. You stand in the pit and stomp the mud and prepare. And those activities, and afterwards they would sit down in the afternoon and talk. If we can make it safe, if we can give people purpose and meaning, like a project to do together, they can begin to form new pathways about the other. They can reframe the other by experience.
And so you talk about the forming of new pathways through personal decision making.
Yeah.
There's also the sense of so I'm forming a pathway as I make a decision. But I can also, I believe, help you form a pathway as the decision I make is to engage interpersonally.
Yeah.
So
it's like a ripple effect.
Yeah. So there's this story. Just brief reference to shout out. We had a gal, Melissa Gibson, maiden name growing up to Paiva. There's a movie out, documentary called Return to Palau, where her family was tragically murdered by a guy that had been a perpetrator and meth addict or whatever. The grandmother, in going to get Melissa when they found out she was still alive, she had been thrown down a gully for dead, wanders her way out, finds her way back to the school. The grandmother goes to the jail and says to the man that murdered her son and daughter and her grandson, says, "You're a sick man right now, but I want to see you again when I see my son in the kingdom. I want you to be there. And if you will take responsibility and ownership for your decision making, you can be a different person."
Wow.
And when Melissa recounted that story, she's like, for grandma, there was no real emotionalism or sensationalism in that. It was just kind of a matter of principle. Practical, to just go say, this doesn't have to be the way the story ends. And somehow I believe her belief that there was hope for him, her choice to engage interpersonally with somebody that she probably just, a part of her maybe wanted to just see him dead, but her choice to engage in a way to say there is hope and there is a potential for life that is different from what you had before. He ends up becoming baptized, giving his heart to faith, and ends up influencing the other guys in the jail, all because somebody chose to engage with him by their personal decision, thereby helping to awaken his personal decision, and new pathways are formed.
Wow. The parallels are really clear here, because Filbert, who becomes like family to Maria. I mean, when her daughter grows up and gets married, they don't just invite him to the wedding. They ask him to be the MC at the wedding. And that just blew me away, because when I first met him 25 years after the genocide in 2019, anything positive she said about him, I just found myself subconsciously discounting, because I'm like, if you assign anything positive, I discovered later, I had this subconscious belief, really messed up, but it was subconscious. So I don't feel shame, but it, really messed up belief that if you assign any value to somebody who's done something horrible, you're somehow diminishing the horribleness of what they did or their responsibility. Now, that's not logical and it's not true, but it was subconscious. And that's one of the dangers of our subconscious beliefs, why we need to examine and discover what they are. But Maria, she'll when she realizes that I'm struggling, she'll start telling me all these positive stories about him. And I'll recognize when I'm struggling, I was stuck in 1994. I only saw him as a killer, as, one of the perpetrators of the genocide. She wasn't stuck in 94. We were 25 years later. Maria helped get me out of 94 and bring me to today. And when I asked her, didn't you have some family who survived and maybe came to the wedding and were angry that this guy was at the wedding? She said, yeah. I said, so why did you do it? She said, because it was our wedding, me and my daughter, it was our home. It was our choice. And in effect, she was saying, I'm responsible for my healing, not my family. And my timeline is me, not my family setting that up. And I put her in the center of the spotlight, and I'm like, why'd you do it? And how, and all this. Then she steps out and she puts Filbert in the center. And she says, but you know what? When my daughter had kids, she asked him to be the godfather, and his family got angry with her, with him for doing it. My initial response, I don't give a rip about him and his family, But as time goes on, I'm like, this is like how Maria is doing this. At least one of the ways. She should be in the spotlight, and she deserves it. But she's also well enough, healthy enough to step out of the spotlight and put Filbert in the spotlight and to see things from his perspective and empathize with him. And I'm like, wow. She's not only gotten free from anger and bitterness, but she has gone on to a totally different, Filbert is a totally different person, I think, in her mind, than the 1994 18-year-old. And at the end, as she was telling me all these positive things about Filbert, like, trying to help this guy, help me along, she says, it's wonderful to be part of making somebody beautiful again. And Filbert is beautiful. And I think about you and what you just said about somebody's choice, this grandma in that case choice to go to prison and talk to that guy. It's incredible to me, and for many people it's unthinkable. And I try to help people understand we're talking about a journey of years. You're hearing it in 15 minutes.
Yeah.
But this is a journey of years, a journey of anger and suffering and grief and loneliness, and then a little window, a little light called love. Another, in that same community that we were talking to that time, there was a group of ladies who said, one of the group, I was with a group of kids from Chicago, from some pretty tough areas of Chicago, who are studying peace building. And one of the kids said, what about God, to one of these ladies? And I don't know if she was related to a perpetrator or a survivor. They were just all there together in the building, these communities. And they said, well, we thought at the beginning, God has forgotten us. And then it got worse, and we thought God doesn't like us. And it got even worse, and we decided we don't like God. And then she kind of quit. And the young man said, but then what? And I was so happy he did, because she goes, well, then we decided to try God again. We got really lonely. And she says, our anger and our bitterness and our grief drove us deeper into love. And again, that's counterintuitive, because so many times to me, anger and bitterness and grief can drive us into more anger and bitterness and grief, and an unending cycle of suffering and pain. But somehow these women got a glimpse of a way out, like a life raft, a life preserver, and they found when they were drowning, their way out was love, was a love that is not logical, and a love that is compassionate and empathy. And that's where I believe they found their healing, and people like Filbert found his. So I got this little voice in the back of my head saying, come on, Carl, you're like putting a bow on it and sounding like it's all neat and tidy. And it's not. And it's not the same for different people.
Praise God that love is a mess.
Yeah.
And that he chose to enter the mess to show us that he has come not just to make us beautiful again of his own kind of, sometimes we characterize God as he's the loving one making us all loving. Praise him that he has chosen the broken to make one another beautiful. I think of Stephen, coming back to to this genocidal figure that would write 2/3 of the New Testament.
Yeah.
That they laid their coats at his feet as he observed Stephen saying, Father, do not hold this sin against them.
Yeah.
And somehow I think that moment rang and rang and rang in the mind of Saul, who would become Paul, and it opened his heart to become a decision maker who would experience new neural pathways. And the same God that reached Saul, who would become Paul through Stephen, has reached your Philip. What's his name again? The two
Filbert.
Characters, Filbert and Maria. And
Maria.
Here is Maria saying, I get to be a part of making him beautiful again. So, dear listener, today, as we play the outro music, my prayer for you is that you will have the opportunity in your little sphere of influence to help make somebody beautiful again. And maybe if you're just hung up in your own bitterness and unforgiveness through your own decision making to just be kind to yourself, it'll be becoming beautiful again by being grateful and looking for who you can bless. So with that, we say thank you, Carl, for being with us.
Oh, thanks for the opportunity. Good to be with you.
Until we meet again, go and intersect with somebody for your blessing and for the glory of God. Cheers.